If somebody asked you, who is Kimbo Slice? How would you answer that question? It is not so easy. Kimbo Slice was an incredibly interesting person, yes, but that really is an insufficient way to describe his, frankly, miraculous life. He was so many things. He was almost an avatar of his own viral videos in some way. He was the first real manifestation of what it meant to be part of the YouTube generation. He was an immigrant. He was a resultant, an outcome of the fight economy. He was an everyman. He was an MMA icon. He was an MMA fighter. The limits you can place on Kimbo Slice do him no justice. They don't seek to clarify things. They only narrow what actually is a life that was, while not boundless, certainly expansive. Welcome, everyone. My name is Luke Thomas. It is the day after the tragic news has hit us. Kimbo Slice passed away in a Florida hospital yesterday, June the 6th, 2016. He was 42 years old. The cause of death we don't yet know. Obviously, he has received a number of well wishes from MMA luminaries and others. My timeline last night on Twitter was filled not merely with people in the MMA world expressing their sorrow, but the sports world generally. People like Pablo Torre and others from ESPN sort of waxing poetic about the life of Kimbo Slice. But I refer you to the question I asked to open this video. Who was Kimbo Slice? It is a difficult question to answer, but I think we should at least make some effort to do it, and we should do it in the parts that matter the most, or at least make the most sense. So let's take a stab at that. The first thing I would say about who Kimbo Slice was is he was an unbelievable ratings draw. He was a phenomenon. Just anecdotally, I covered 3 of Kimbo Slice's fights. His James Thompson fight, the Ken Shamrock fight, and the Dada 5000 fight. If you were to believe what you read online about who Kimbo was and how terrible he was, and if you were to absorb this endless wave of criticism that he seemed to also elicit, it had no bearing on the reality of the present moment in those arenas. Never. It never, ever worked. He walked out and would come to a roaring applause. It was unbelievable what he could do. And throughout the course of his career was just an exceptional ratings draw everywhere he went. For starters, he was part of 2 of the most watched MMA events ever on television. Elite XC Heat in 2008, where he lost to Seth Petrozelli. And then, of course, Elite XC Primetime, where he fought James Thompson. That one had a peak of 7.3 million people when he competed. That one also, by the way, was the first one ever on network television. More than that, when he was part of The Ultimate Fighter, he was part of the most watched episode ever of The Ultimate Fighter when he fought Roy Nelson. That season he was on, season 10, is still the most watched season ever in the history of that show. His last fight against Dada 5000, and whatever else we want to make of it, it is still the most watched MMA event for Bellator on Spike TV. He was far and away the biggest ratings draw virtually everywhere he went. Not so much in Ultimate Fighting Championship, where there was obviously some big names, but in Elite XC, in Bellator, and for a short time, Cage Fury Fighting Championships, this guy was a walking ratings draw. It was absolutely incredible both to watch the numbers he could pull in an abstract way from a distance and then to encounter his popularity up front. But it really doesn't do a whole lot of justice to say, well, people like to watch him on TV or they would buy tickets to his shows, although that's true as well. But, look, there are other people, and I'm going to bring up a name that's not as popular as Kimbo Slice and saying Adrian Broner. But Adrian Broner, he has certainly fallen on hard times as well. But he's a popular figure. But he doesn't really draw outside of a couple of demos. Kimbo Slice drew everybody. Old, young, black, white, male, female. People who see themselves as part of the preppy world, people who see themselves as part of the metal scene, and you can go on and on and on. Not merely defined by music or racial identity, but by every cross-section of humanity you can imagine. You could not really pinpoint his audience other than to say it was large. These abstractions we use about how big his numbers were, we almost have to, because once you begin to break down the components of who that audience was, it touched major cross sections of humanity in ways that almost no other MMA fighter I've seen be able to do. There are other fighters who were more popular, but they were maybe able to draw from a regional power or able to draw from sort of one kind of demographic. Kimbo Slice had the power to draw from every kind in ways that is truly unique. So in answering that question about who Kimbo Slice was, he was an absolute phenomenon of attraction. Kimbo Slice was also a rags to riches story. Here was a guy who, for a time in his life, was unemployed, who had his life devastated by a hurricane, his property, to the extent that he had any, destroyed. A guy who had to bathe in the oceans while he was living in his Pathfinder, and found a way somehow to get a job through an association as a strip club bouncer and then as a porn bodyguard, and then we know the rest of the story about what he eventually became. But this was a guy who never had it easy, who never had, at least in the early stages of his life, a lot of handouts given to him. This was a guy who struggled to move forward, found any way to do it that he could, and then once opportunity struck, understandably ran with it. Now, that ultimately led to some criticism of who he was and where he came from and what he represented, but let it be known that eventually a little bit of luck struck the life of Kimbo Slice, but for, frankly, the majority of it, as he died at age 42 and never really hit any kind of stardom until well past 30, he was a guy who had to find any method imaginable to care for his family and his children, and it was never particularly very easy until the very end. Kimbo Slice was the American dream. It's really who he was, you know. This was a guy who came from an immigrant background, Bahamian background. And we mentioned before that he was impoverished for much of his life, certainly, you know, economically challenged. And nevertheless, here's a guy who, you know, found some kind of way forward in this world, albeit in an unorthodox way, which I think actually if you talk to Kimbo Slice, he'd be the first to tell you this was never a plan that he had in his mind. This was something that just sort of developed, and he wanted to see where he could take it, which I think most people, particularly fathers or people caring for others, can understand. But, you know, to have an immigrant experience, to come here, to have such economic difficulties, to have such difficulties finding your way forward in a society that sometimes will open the door for you and sometimes it will not. And to still be a rousing, roaring success that he was, to be a star on television, to have other athletes asking for your autograph, to be, frankly, what he was, which is a household name. That is something I think any immigrant or anybody will tell you that this is the essential definition of the American dream. To come here, to, in early stages and even middle stages, languish, and then pursue a dream, pursue an opportunity, and turn it into something and become something better than what you came here as, and set up everyone else around you. Kimbo Slice is the quintessential American dream. That is not a glib thing to say. That is a fact. That is who he was, and it would never, ever came easy for him, at least, again, in the early stages, but eventually he was able to become something greater than who he started out as. But here's the truth about Kimbo Slice. He was absolutely, in the early stages of his fighting career, reviled. There was these two contrasting phenomenon going on at one time, or at least one in one stage, and then the two began to clash. He had these backyard fights that he began to take because he could make $3,000, $5,000 at a time. People put these on YouTube, and he became this sensation. And as he began to train with the Avalon brothers and eventually with Bas Rutten and American Top Team, and we all know the story there, he faced an intense amount of criticism, but he always had those third-party validators. It's just it took a long time for people to listen to him. When he was headlining cards, it wasn't really the guys he was fighting against who would say, this guy is trash, he is absolutely nothing, which is frankly a little bit par for the course, but there was this indictment of him all the time as a pretender, as someone who wasn't that good. And in some ways, the criticism was valid. I mean, he wasn't a top-tier MMA fighter necessarily, but they would absolutely disparage him in every way possible. Other fighters below him on the card could not fathom or stand the idea that this guy deserved a place above them. And certainly he fell on hard times, like October 4th, losing to Seth Petrozelli. This was sort of this culminating moment, this time in his life where he was audited, right? There was this examination of his skill in a real way that had not happened before. But here was the truth about Kimbo Slice. He took opportunities that came to him simply because he had never had really any in his life beforehand, a very understandable human motivation. But when he realized that there was something more to what he was doing, that there was a right way to be doing it, he took the path. And he took the path through this cauldron of criticism, of training late in his athletic age, of injuries he had been carrying prior to any kind of backyard fights he had ever had. And he became something of a reformation project by his own doing. He went on The Ultimate Fighter, and he tried to get better. And what you saw of Slice at that time in The Ultimate Fighter was he began to reflect on his career and his journey and what he wanted out of his life. And the real important contribution that The Ultimate Fighter gave to him was that beforehand, you never really knew who he was. You may have seen his backyard fights. You may have seen his fights on television. You may have even read a magazine profile. But you had never really, in a real way, saw this guy honestly speak to you. You had never seen him talk about his inner life. You had never seen him talk about who he was and why making these principled stands about how he moved forward in the world mattered to him. And I think once that began to happen, even with, a not great showing against Houston Alexander, although he came out on top, and certainly not a great showing against Matt Mitrione, the tide began to turn for Kimbo. That reformation project had begun to turn him into something of a fully endearing figure. The third-party validation from the rest of the MMA world began to get louder and louder and louder. Not so much that he was the best heavyweight on earth, but that he was a guy who deserved to be taken seriously. He was a guy who deserved to be treated fairly. And he was a guy who was basically impossible to dislike. One of the enduring realities of anyone who ever encountered Kimbo Slice was you cannot believe what an unbelievably friendly, I'm sorry to use those words like that, guy Kimbo Slice was. Just yes, he could turn on the ferocity when he needed to. He could be as violent as the world that he came from. Those were things available to him. But over time, he took these principled stands about, if this is going to be a thing, I've got to take it seriously and do it the right way. And he tried. And he tried and he had a little bit of success. And he tried and he failed. But he certainly never was... People called him a pretender, and that's really not true. He was a guy who maybe got in over his head a little bit, but then wanted to fix that. And maybe he tried to fix it too late in his athletic life, but he really made an earnest attempt at it. And that brought him eventually to a boxing career that really didn't go anywhere, and maybe that was ill-advised too. But he ultimately came back around and went back to Bellator in this elderly statesman role. And I can tell you that the criticisms from other fighters, some wanted to be in headlining roles or co-main event roles. There was still a little bit of that chatter. But the truth is, most of the fighters I ever saw with Kimbo Slice in those 2 Bellator fights, they were happy to glad hand with him. They were happy simply to share a dais with him. They were happy simply to be around him. And frankly, to receive the extra attention that he brought, which they had initially in 2007 and 2008 firmly rejected. That whole thing had gone away because he had paid his dues in a way that simply no one could deny him. And here's the last part about Kimbo Slice. Look, you can say whatever you want about his last fights, and his last fight in particular, and being there live with my colleague Sean Al-Shadi, we had a responsibility to talk honestly about that fight. It was not good. It was quite terrible, as a matter of fact. And that's really no secret. But here's the truth about Kimbo Slice outside of that. He was so much fun. He was so friendly. He was the coolest guy in the room. And at times he was, a guy who maybe lived up to his reputation from the street. And at times he was vulgar. And at times he was things that were, lacking in proper decorum. But in every kind of forgivable way. And the kind of thing you say, not so much about someone who doesn't know better, but about someone, it doesn't bother you that they were like that. In fact, because they had so many other endearing, charming aspects to their identity and so many other puzzling but delightfully puzzling things about their life, you just didn't care anymore. This guy was a porn bodyguard. You never got the sense that he had a life of vice. He was a family man. I met his wife. His children would go to his fights. These were kids you could see being in your high school or middle school, whatever the age they were at the time that you met them. His wife seemed like someone who could easily just be your neighbor. These were really, frankly, salt-of-the-earth kind of people. The interesting part about Kimbo Slice was that he was this mixed martial arts icon, and he was this everyman. And at the same time, before, when he was this YouTube sensation, he was this guy who you put on this place where you were afraid of him, but you wanted to see what he could do. And Gary Shaw, tried to make something of that work, giving him these fights that were stylistically, appropriate for him. And we all know the story there. But over time, while promoters never really got away from that, the pull of Kimbo Slice changed. As I mentioned before, he became something of not merely a working class hero, everyone's hero. Everyone wanted to see Kimbo Slice do well. All of the polarizing things that were about his early MMA career, they vanished in the later stages of it. Everyone began to cheer for him. There were no boos for Kimbo. There may have been boos for the last fight because it wasn't so great, but there were no boos for him. Never. Not at least not in those later stages. This was a guy that everyone just came to realize he was just trying to live out his life the best he could with the opportunities that were presented to him. He had a little bit of extra money, he had a little bit of extra fame, but he never really strayed from what he was. He became a more matured version of what we encountered back in 2008. Okay, fair enough. But he was still Kimbo Slice. He was this larger-than-life figure when he needed to be, and he was this dad when he needed to be. And if you ever saw it in real life, you know that this is undeniable. This is truly undeniable. He was just a family guy who had a rough go of it early in his life and took advantage of some opportunities, some more ill-advised than others, but made a principled stand to do something about it in a way that made sense for him and who he wanted to be, and turn it into something. There's actually a great quote from Dan Le Batard. He has, in my mind, the best profile ever on Kimbo Slice. It was back in 2008, and it was in ESPN, the magazine. The profile is called Kimbo Slice. Not quite what you were thinking, which seems to me so prescient that he would write this, and so smart, and really so entirely appropriate. He was more than what you thought he was. But here's the best part. It's a quote almost near the end of the article, and I think this really sums it up for me. Who is Kimbo Slice? Yes, he was popular. Yes, he was an immigrant. Yes, he was the American dream and family man and everything else you want to say about him. Kimbo Slice was mixed martial arts. Dan Le Batard writes, "Besides, Kimbo's and MMA's stories are exactly the same. Up from the gutter, secretly popular, misunderstood, violent, criticized, dangerous, fun, cool, bloody, viral, and now, finally mainstream." Who was Kimbo Slice? Maybe you have your own answer. There's a lot of different ways to answer that question. But for me, Kimbo Slice was mixed martial arts. I am forever grateful that we had a chance to watch somebody do something with his life in the way that he did. I am grateful that he contributed to mixed martial arts in the way that he did. I am grateful that I had the opportunity to watch some of his fights, whether they were good fights or not. And I am glad that the community had a chance over time to finally learn who he was, what made him tick, and why he was so special. Thank you for everything, Kimbo Slice. I know I speak for many in the mixed martial arts community when I say we will miss you very much.